Hello, my name is Joe Sprinkle, and the paper that I am going to read today is Torah and Narrative in Exodus and Leviticus. The regulations of the Pentateuch come to us embedded in a narrative framework that gives us a context for interpreting those regulations. This paper will consider ways in which laws and narrative intertwine in the Pentateuch, specifically examining the laws and narratives in Exodus for this purpose. The longer paper will include Leviticus as well. My first example comes from Exodus 11 through 14 on the Passover and the plague of the firstborn, which mixes Torah or law and narrative. Note the intertwining of narrative and ritual regulation in this material. So you start off with a narrative, a prophecy narrative in Exodus 11, 1 through 10. God through Moses tells Pharaoh how the plague of the firstborn would affect Egypt but not Israel, and how he would harden Pharaoh's heart. But then you have laws. I call that Law A, Exodus 12, 1 through 11, the Passover ordinances, talk about the date of Passover, specifications for the ritual. But then you have narrative B, prophecy in chapter 12 and 13, how God predicts that he would bring judgment on Egypt and its gods, but that the blood of the Passover lambs would protect them from God's judgment. But then you go back to law in Exodus 12, 14 through 28, the unleavened bread ordinances. But then you go back to narrative, which gives a fulfillment of the earlier predictions. Exodus 12, 29 through 42, how the plague of the firstborn struck and Pharaoh let Israel go as God had previously predicted in what I label narratives A and B. But then you go back to laws in Exodus 12, 43 through 49, Passover ordinances about who may eat the Passover, where it can be eaten, how it should be eaten. And then you go back to narrative again in Exodus 12, 50 and 51, a narrative summary of how Israel obeyed God and God brought them out of Egypt. But then you go back to law, Law D, Exodus 13, 1 through 16, Passover ordinances about consecrating the firstborn and making permanent Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. But then you go to narrative E, the fulfillment in Exodus 13, 17 through 14:31, Israel leaves Egypt for the narrative A prediction, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened, just as it was predicted, and he attacked, though God intervened to save. Now, what are we to make of this intertwining of law and narrative? And many readers find this mixture of law and narrative confusing. Doug Stewart writes on this in his commentary on Exodus. From a modern reader's point of view, the lengthy descriptions of how to prepare for and celebrate the annual ritual of Passover, coupled with the instructions on consecrating, redeeming the firstborn of humans and animals found in Exodus 12 and 13, seem to interfere with the flow of the narrative. What could the writer have been thinking? As Stewart points out, critical scholarship traditionally has tried to explain this problem on the basis of hypothetical sources, an intrusion of P material into a JE narrative. As Stalberg notes, that this mode of criticism does not see the text as literature, but as artifact. But what if, on the other hand, we assume the text to have been produced by an intelligent author or editor? What would his literary purpose be? It's interesting that the Passover law with the plague of the firstborn and the Exodus narratives is a way of combining the past, the present, and future. This is Stahlberg's contribution to the discussion. For subsequent generations, the laws, while originally largely carried out by Israel of Moses' day, look forward to the future in which subsequent generations would remember these events. Indeed, some of what God through Moses commands could not have been carried out by the first generation, namely the requirement of a sacred assembly with no work the day after Passover, Exodus 12, verse 16. For Israel began the Exodus on that day, according to 1231. The rituals are a lasting ordinance, 1217, for you and your descendants, 1224. The laws serve to produce a collective memory of the Exodus event by recognizing Nisan as Israel's first month and by celebrating what happened for generations to come, 1214, and by performing rituals that commemorate how God brought Israel out of Egypt, 13:3. Thus, these laws direct hearers in both the present, Moses' day, and the future on how perpetually to celebrate and memorialize the events of the Exodus through ritual. Future generations repeat actions by Israel in Moses' day, so later generations relive what happened to that past generation in the present. The result is that future generations would come to identify with the Israel of Moses' day and see God's act of salvation for Israel then as God's act of salvation for themselves in a generation beyond the original events. Thus, this intertwining of law and narrative creates a condition where memory of the past facilitates a collective identity, as Stahlberg puts it, facilitating a fusion of the past and the present. My second example of Torah and narrative comes from Exodus 19 through 24, the establishment of the covenant between God and Israel through Moses, which likewise intertwines law and narrative. One way of outlining Exodus 19 through 24 is chiastically. You begin with a narrative, the covenant offered in Exodus 19. But then you have laws, general laws, the Decalogue in Exodus 21 through 17. But then you have a narrative which talks about the people's fear when God manifested himself on Mount Sinai, chapter 20, verses 18 through 21. But then you go back to laws, more specific laws, the book of the covenant in Exodus 20, verses 22 through 33. And then you go back to narrative, the covenant accepted in chapter 24, 1 through 11. So narrative, law, narrative, law, narrative. Now, the most important thing about a chiastic structure is typically either what is in the middle or what are at the ends. Arguably here, the main theme of these chapters is the narrative about the covenant that brackets everything, what I call A and A prime, the offering of the covenant in chapter 19, the acceptance of the covenant in chapter 24. So the overall theme is covenant. The next band moves towards the center, B and B prime, or the laws, which are the stipulations of the covenant. And then in the middle, C, you have the concept of the fear of God, where Moses said to the terrified people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, so that fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." And this statement is ironic, saying, do not fear on the one hand, but God has come so that fear of him may be before you. But the sense of it is, do not be afraid in the sense of terrified of God. Nonetheless, have the proper fear of the Lord, the proper fear or respect that will cause you to turn away from sin, that you may not sin, and obey the stipulations of the covenant. Fear of the Lord is what motivates obedience to the covenant stipulations, and so is at the heart of the covenant. This chiastic intertwining of laws and narratives was produced by not placing everything in chronological sequence. I've argued elsewhere that Exodus 19 includes all the events before the covenant was accepted, including the giving of the laws, while chapters 20 through 23 represents flashback that tells in more detail what happened in chapter 19. The story only proceeds chronologically with Exodus chapter 24. Now, this resumptive repetition allows the laws to be given as a group and thus makes them easier to teach than if they had been interspersed by narratives about what was happening simultaneously as they were being given. So if you said, have no other gods before me, and then you talk about the lightning and the thunder and the all the events going on at the time this was being given, well, that makes the Ten Commandments less easy to teach didactically. Intertwining of law and narrative underscores the divine authority of these laws and uses the laws to convey the righteous character of God. I move to my third example. A third example of the intertwining of Torah and narrative is in Exodus 25 through 40. Exodus 25 through 31 and 35 through 40 are about the tabernacle. The first section is primarily regulations concerning the building of the tabernacle and ordaining priests. But then Exodus 25 through 40 is a mixture of regulations and narrative descriptions of the actual building of the tabernacle in accord with those regulations, followed by Yahweh covering the tabernacle as a pillar of cloud. Exodus 32 through 34, on the other hand, is primarily a narrative, the golden calf story, with some legal material in chapter 34 within the narrative. Thus, a mostly legal and legal fulfillment unit on the tabernacle surrounds the more purely narrative account of the golden calf and its aftermath. One way of outlining this is as follows. You have the tabernacle laws for building the tabernacle and ordaining priests. But then you go to primarily narrative, the golden calf narrative, though it does have some laws at the end and its aftermath. Then you go back to the tabernacle law obedience narratives, building the tabernacle according to the regulations in chapters 25 through 31. And that goes through 35:1 through 40:33. But then you have the tabernacle completion narrative, where the glory of the Lord covers the tabernacle in chapter 40:34 through 38. Now, readers of Exodus often see the golden calf story as a J or a JE interruption of P, the account of the building of the tabernacle. This source-critical approach leads to reading Exodus 32 through 34 apart from its context of the construction of the tabernacle, instead imagining some other context, such as a anti-Aaronide, pro-Levite polemic. But why this interruption of tabernacle regulations with the golden calf story, on the assumption that it's intentional and conveys deliberate literary purpose? To investigate this, it's important to look at the tabernacle regulations and then relate them to the purpose of the golden calf story in Exodus 32 through 34. Exodus 25 and verse 8 states that the purpose for the construction of the tabernacle, it was, and let them build me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. Sanctuary, Hebrew mikdash, refers to a holy place, a place set apart for divine purpose. It is also called the tabernacle, 25:9, Hebrew mishkan, that means a dwelling place. The tabernacle was to be the visible symbol of God's dwelling among his people and the locale of the visible manifestation of his presence. At this place, God says, I will meet, Hebrew word ya'ad, with you, and I will speak with you, 25:22. This relates to another name of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, related to the same root to meet in 27, verse 21 is first used. Now, there is a tension between the theological concepts implied by the names of the tabernacle. The dwelling place, tabernacle, and tent of meeting speaks of the imminence and closeness of God, who made a covenant with Israel. Compare its Ark of the Covenant described in chapter 25, verses 10 through 22. On the other hand, God's dwelling in a holy place, a sanctuary, speaks of a God who is transcendent and set apart from the people and not easily approachable. God's remoteness is seen in the thick curtains of the tabernacle, chapter 26 and chapter 36, and the use of cherubim artistically as protective guards that secluded the Holy of Holies in chapter 26 and chapter 36, and also 25, 17 through 22, and 37, 7 through 9. Cloth screens walled off the tabernacle courts from the camps of Israel, as we see in chapter 27 and chapter 38. And all this speaks of the remote holiness of God that makes him difficult to approach. So why does this story of the golden calf interrupt the account of the building of the tabernacle? Sarna makes a good proposal. The literary arrangement conveys the impression that the apostasy of the people, that is, their alienation from God, interfered with the building of the intended sanctuary that was to be the tent of meeting between God and Israel. The work could begin only after their reconciliation through the mediation of Moses. The golden calf story is, in effect, a parody of the tabernacle regulations. Note the following parallels and contrasts between the tabernacle regulations and the golden calf narrative, and much of this is after Mobley. So in the tabernacle regulations, the tabernacle was given as a symbol or vehicle of Yahweh's presence that would go before the people to lead them. But the golden calf story, the people seek to produce a symbol or vehicle of God's presence in the calf to go before them and lead them. In the tabernacle was to be made out of offerings willingly given by the people, 25, 2 through 7. The calf was made from ornaments of gold willingly given by the people, 32 and verse 3. The construction of the tabernacle must follow God's specifications exactly, it says, 25:9. Well, the calf was made without God's permission or direction and is in fact a violation of God's command, as in the Ten Commandments. Aaron with his sons is specified to preside over the tabernacle as priests to mediate God's presence to the people. You read about that in 27:1 and 28:1. Well, Aaron presides over the making of the golden calf that the people believe would mediate God's presence to them in 32, 2 through 5. And then burnt offerings and peace offerings were to be offered on the bronze altar and presented before Yahweh in the tabernacle, according to Exodus 29. But burnt offerings and peace offerings were offered in celebration of the making of the golden calf in 32:6, and indeed sacrificed to the calf in 32 and verse 8. Exodus 32 through 34 presupposes the substance of Exodus 19 through 24, where God entered into a formal covenant relationship with Israel after leading them from Egypt, with the Decalogue standing at the heart of that relationship. Israel's making the calf constituted a turning away from what God commanded them in chapter 32 and verse 8, alluding to Exodus 20, verses 4 and 5, that prohibited the making of images of Yahweh. And I argue strongly that the calf represents Yahweh and not some other god, but I'll deal with that in a footnote. Exodus 23's prohibition against making a god of gold, Elohe Zahav, is alluded to in 32, verse 31, that echoes 20:23, and accusing Israel of making an Elohe Zahav, a god of gold. And there are many other allusions to Exodus 19 through 24. Aaron is prominent in both the golden calf narrative and the tabernacle laws. In Exodus 32, Aaron, as the anticipated spiritual leader, is rebuked by Moses and the narrator for his sinful irresponsibility in making of the idolatrous calf. Adam in Genesis 3:12 blamed both Eve, the woman, and God, the woman who you gave to be with me, for his partaking of the forbidden fruit. Similarly here, Aaron tries to shift the blame both to Moses and to the people for his partaking of the golden, the idolatry or the forbidden fruit of the golden calf in Exodus 32, 22 through 24. By quoting the people's complaint about Moses' absence in verse 23b, Aaron in effect was blaming Moses. In Aaron's version of the event, the calf seemingly magically popped out of the fire, 32 verse 24b, as if he had had nothing to do with it. But neither Moses nor the narrator buys this story. Now we might raise the question, why was Aaron not punished for his role in the people's idolatry? And this can be explained as God's mercy and grace, just as God showed mercy to Adam in not killing him before he had children in Genesis 3, even though he had every right to do so. According to Deuteronomy 9 and verse 20, Moses had prayed for Aaron, just as is recorded in Exodus 32 and 33 and 34, that he prayed for the people as a whole. And that is what mitigated God's wrath on both. The sons of Aaron, who served as priests, were Levites, but the majority of Levites were not designated to be priests. Levites as a whole, however, accepted the role as executioners of those most caught up in the golden calf idolatry, including some fellow Levites, chapter 32, 25 through 29. And this is also related to the tabernacle of Exodus 25 through 31 and 35 through 40. The Decalogue's prohibition of other gods or images applied to the tabernacle means that no images of deity would be allowed there. Exodus 38 and verse 21 mentions that the Levites were keeper of records under the direction of Aaron's son, Ithamar. But in Numbers 4, verse 28 and verse 33, Ithamar also supervised their activity to guard the tabernacle and protect it from any encroachments. And the Levites were even to put to death any intruder, Numbers chapter 3, verses 5 through 10 and verse 38. Their actions in Exodus 32 against the idolaters shows that they had begun their roles as guards of the tabernacle already. For by punishing those most responsible for the golden calf, they were protecting the soon-to-be-built tabernacle against idolatry. Exodus 32:29 notes, "Today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and his brother." That's 32:29, compare 28:41. The tabernacle is also called the tent of meeting, 27:21, but the golden calf story indicates that Moses established an earlier tent of meeting, described in 33:7 through 11. This simple tent of meeting is thus a precursor of the tabernacle. It was a place where God would meet and communicate with people. Quote, everyone who sought the Lord, 33:7. The tabernacle ultimately assumes that earlier tent's name, but the tabernacle would have other roles beyond what the simple tent of meeting played. It would be the repository of the Ark of the Covenant and the center of sacrificial worship. Moreover, the tabernacle's location in the midst of the camp, as described in Numbers 2 and verse 2, symbolizes a greater intimacy between God and his people than the earlier tent, whose location was, quote, far off from the camp, 33 and verse 7. The earlier tent gave more focus on God's remote transcendence. The golden calf incident raised the question of whether it was possible for a holy God to dwell in the middle of a stiff-necked people without God's wrath breaking out on them. God's preliminary answer was negative. I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people, chapter 33 and verse 3. At this point, it seemed as if the whole tabernacle project was doomed to failure, for without God's presence, the tabernacle would be no more than an empty shrine. The final answer, however, changed after Moses' intercession, where he asked God, if I have really found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in our midst, even though this is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance. That's 34 and verse 9. This leads to God's agreeing to dwell in their midst, 33 and verse 13, that allow the tabernacle project to proceed. That reversal is reflected in the new tablets of the Decalogue given to replace the ones that Moses had broken. That's 34 verses 1 and 4, symbolic that the covenant was being restored. The Ark of the Covenant would hold those tablets, 25:16 and 24, chapter 40 and verse 20, also Deuteronomy 10 verse 2. Replacement of these tablets and their storage in the Ark of the tabernacle thus symbolize that the Israelites had been forgiven and their covenant with God was repaired so that God's presence could go with them and lead them and protect them. Thus, God renewed the covenant with his people, promising to do wonders for them, 34 and verse 10. Moses also wanted to be shown God's ways, 33:13, and to see God's glory and face, 33:18 through 20, to which God responds with a revelation of his character in chapter 34, 5 through 8, particularly his attributes of benevolence and love, attributes that do not contradict and yet are in tension with his holiness. It was God's grace that allowed God to renew the covenant and to forgive his people. The expression of God's grace and judgment here echoes a similar expression in the Decalogue, where God in Exodus 20 verses 4 and 5 describes himself on the one hand as a jealous God visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation, but alternatively showing steadfast love, Hebrew chesed, to those who love him to 1,000 generations, thus indicating that God's grace to 1,000 generations surpasses his judgment, which only goes to 3 or 4. Thus, this narrative account of the theophany echoes that earlier account in the Decalogue of God's grace and how his grace exceeds his judgment. All this repetition of material from earlier laws and promises is a way of indicating that when God again made a covenant with Israel, 34:10, it was not a brand new covenant, but simply a renewal of the old covenant made possible by God's gracious character of forgiveness. The last unit in 34:22 through 34 also draws on the earlier account by noting that Moses' stay on the mountain this time matched the 40 days that he had stayed on the mountain previously. 34:28 compare 24:18. Earlier, it was affirmed that no mortal could literally see God's face and live, 33 verse 20 and 23. But now the Israelites will be able to see the glory of God, not in an idol made of gold, but in the face of this prophet Moses. And by implication, later generations would see God's glory in the revelation, the Torah from God that Moses would record. God's general guidance through an angel, 32:34, 33:2, echoing 23:20 through 23, which Bricknell, by the way, takes to mean Moses himself, was still not adequate. They would also be able to see God's glory and sense his presence more directly in the tabernacle as an extension of Israel's Sinai experience, whose regulations and construction surround the golden calf narrative. Yahweh's promised presence in the tabernacle is thus supplemented by the glorious presence of his spokesman and his word. For God's revelation in Scripture of his character is in fact a glimpse of God himself and a token of his presence. And those like Moses who proclaim that revelation also convey a veiled glimpse of the glory of God. The insertion of the story of the golden calf into the tabernacle regulation thus plays an important literary role. James Watts summarizes well several purposes which the placing of the golden calf story in the middle of the tabernacle material conveys. It creates suspense and intrigue between the tabernacle instructions of chapters 25 through 31 and their fulfillment in chapters 35 through 40. The golden calf story, secondly, enhances the sense of closure and satisfaction conveyed by the story of the tabernacle's completion and God's inhabiting it in chapter 40, along with the ordination of Aaron and his sons and their inauguration to priestly service in Leviticus 8 and 9. You might say it produces a tension so that the story could reach a climax and then a more satisfying resolution. Thirdly, the golden calf story produces in Exodus 25 through 40 a creation, fall, restoration theme. Creation, the instructions to build a tabernacle; fall, the golden calf story, but then restoration, where God forgives them in Exodus 34, and they go on and fulfill the plan to build the tabernacle. This plot echoes themes found elsewhere in the Pentateuch. But then I would add to Watts that the golden calf story incorporates into the tabernacle account a theology of grace that balances holiness, a grace that allowed God to forgive his people and maintain the covenant. The tabernacle regulations alone might suppose that Yahweh is purely a legalistic God of rules and regulations. The golden calf story shows that the God of the about to be built tabernacle is a God of both justice, law, and a God of grace, forgiveness. Yahweh is a God who would continue to guide and protect and dwell among his people despite their sins, and reveal himself through the tabernacle, through his prophet, and through the revelation of his word. I have tried to show by these examples in Exodus that the intertwining of Torah and narrative is not accidental or purposeless, but rather the combining of Torah and narrative reflects complex theological and literary purposes. The longer version of this paper will also include a discussion of law and narrative in the book of Leviticus.